a very warm welcome to all of you. This fireside chat is really special to me because I've worked with Sean for a very long time by now. And Sean, he has been on a secondment with the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero for the UK government for 18 months. And has just returned now to the Centre for Energy Ethics, where he is the Director of Policy. So I am thrilled to invite Sean back into the centre and all the work that we are doing. And I am very excited to hear more about the work that he has been doing when he was seconded. Just to kind of set the frame for everyone, could you perhaps tell us a little bit about the work that you did for DESNZ? What kind of task were you involved in, and why were you seconded to DESNZ?
Yeah. Well, thanks so much everyone for attending, and it's really nice to be back. Yeah, so I started this secondment with the UK Department for Energy Security Net Zero in the summer of 2024, and it kind of came about in the way that at least for me, most things seem to come about in a completely unexpected way, where a colleague of mine reached out and said, "Do you have any PhD students that have recently completed, or somebody else you might know, who would be able to fill this position?" Because they had an opening come up for an analyst position in the department. So I asked around, and nobody was able to fill it with a student. I had a student that might be able to fill it, but they went to go work for somebody else. And so I came back to her and said, you know what, I would really like to do it just basically for fun. Because I thought this, as a researcher, it'd be a really interesting and unique opportunity to step into the inside of government at a time where energy and climate policy were at the top of basically the political agenda. And at that time, there was an election happening. And little did I know that when I started the secondment, it would be prefaced by only a few weeks earlier by the creation of a brand new UK energy company, Great British Energy. And so when I stepped into the position originally, it was to be a lead analyst for a particular program, which was the local net zero accelerator, which I'll have to expand on what that is, but it was a place-based investment program. But then quickly the role expanded to include a whole range of other policy programs, really exciting stuff that, even the people I worked with had no idea were on the horizon. And a lot of the time I was there ended up being on the analytical sponsorship team for Great British Energy. And so what that means is, well, when the government created Great British Energy, it was a brand new corporation. It didn't have any staff. It was just an announcement. It was an idea. And so it was taking this idea and making it real. So this was developing the policy programs, doing the analysis that underpins this policy programs. And this is for everything, the larger sort of program of work, of which I was focused on a particular piece of it, was everything from offshore wind turbines to local energy to intercontinental connectors. And the larger analytical team was tasked with doing the underpinning analysis to support this entire program, of which there's £8 billion of spend in this parliament. So it was kind of an exciting time to step in and to do this. And I think that was primarily what I ended up doing for most of the 18 months, working with all sorts of teams. And again, I'm happy to expand on any of this, but that was primarily it. And it just came to an end at the end of last March, which was kind of an interesting end, because that was the end of the government's fiscal year, and everything sort of came to an end, and we sort of handed things over to Great British Energy, which is now this sort of arm's length corporation with its own staff.
So can you give us a little sense of what a work week was like for you? Was it remote working? Was it in person? How big was the team that you were working with? Did you work with local teams?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like most workplaces, everything seems to have changed after COVID. So many people work remotely as we do, and people are joining us from home and from the office. Most people would be at the office. I worked out of the Edinburgh office, which is not too far from where I live. Many of the team are based in London, so often I travel down to Whitehall, which was kind of neat. It's just off of Trafalgar Square, and you're just down the street from Parliament. And I think the time that I spent there was probably characterized as a time of change. So from very early on, from because of the creation of Great British Energy, because of larger changes in the government, we had a change of the ruling government, but just before I came into this post of this comment post, and it meant that the analytical team that I was on changed, I think, about three times as it sort of expanded and expanded again, and we got reprioritized. And it seems like, in some ways, it was kind of indicative of many of almost like a research project that researchers work on, where our lives are sort of defined by these distinct sort of project phases. And this was seemed to be one of them, where I came into the position, and it was relatively, I think, not slow, but it was not as high pace as I came in. It was just an adjustment period. But then I think from September 24, it became very fast paced. So it was conducting analyses on spending and programs and doing projections of what the government programs would be, doing all sorts of classic analytical work of cost benefit analysis, discounted cash flow models. And I think that was a very intense 5 day a week program. Um, yeah, it was a very interesting time to step into government. In some ways, it reminds me of some of the anthropological ethnographic descriptions from Stefan and other people working inside of different like institutions where you're doing this sort of work. It was very much like that. And then the most recent thing that I was a part of and was really excited to be part of was writing the local power plan, which the government published a few months ago. There's various teams that are involved in this. So there's a legal team, a communications team, a policy team, an analytical team, and I was one of the leads on the evidence annex, which was the evidence supporting the government's program and then contributing to the policy formation itself. And I would say that there was a few very hectic months of writing this between October and February. And I think that's kind of what it looked like. Yeah, lots and lots of coordination. I think, and then I'll stop and stop nattering on. But I think one of the things that struck me about working in this role is just how much coordination and planning goes into every step. Just being in such close contact, not just working in our analysis team, but working hand in hand with policy colleagues who are going back and forth between stakeholders and ministers and sort of gauging what people want, the analysis team that are working the numbers and trying to figure out what will be the economic impact, the legal team who's looking at the language to make sure we're not breaking any laws or contravening any laws that are already on the books, the communications team, and doing that all in really close synchronization meant a lot of like face-to-face or Teams meetings at very fast pace.
So just reflecting on that difference from the academic university setting, I mean, did you feel you could navigate that? Did it feel daunting? How quickly did you kind of find your feet and feel comfortable?
Yeah. I think at first it took a little bit. I think I really didn't quite get a handle on the position for at least I'd say 2 months. And the reason is that, and I think people on this call would probably, maybe this will resonate with you. The government is such a huge organization. Even within the department itself, it is a massive organization. There must be, like, it's going through a period of transformation right now, but it's characterized by probably a dozen different analytical teams specializing in different areas, and each of those dozen teams has its partner sort of communications, policy, and other teams. And it was just a lot to take in all at once in the first few months to understand this organization and such. But I think after that, I started to get this, as I think most people, you come into a position, you're sort of get your head around it. And then I think I started to find my feet a few months in. I think in particular, as I came into the position, the Chancellor, who is the person in UK terms who's in charge of the larger UK budget, announced a spending review, sort of very abruptly. And so I think all of a sudden I was only a few weeks into the position, and we were asked to put together an analysis of how we were going to spend money for the next couple of years, which was slightly frightening because I think I had to remember how to do some of this analytical stuff that I hadn't done for a little while. But then very quickly I was like, right, yes, this is what we're going to do, and then coordinate with colleagues. So it took a little bit, but yeah, I think it was doing the sort of research that I do on finance and such. I think was definitely a good sort of entry into this position.
So when you've been telling me about, the work that you've been doing over the past 18 months, something that has struck me is just how much your analytical skills from kind of earlier in your career that you've been drawing on, right? Like it's a lot. It sounds like your kind of economics training. But what about, your anthropological training and your anthropological insights? To what extent do you feel that the field work you did in Houston was at all relevant to the work you did with Desnes?
Yeah. And the whole time and I think just to be clear to everybody in the call, I was not doing primary research. In many ways, and I'd be happy to expand on this in a bit. In many ways, I feel like this was pre-field research, so like the collecting of ideas and such, for what I see as my current or next project. But for this position in particular, yes, I ended up drawing on a lot of my background in economics, but also the field work I did in Houston. And I think so. I have a mixed background in applied economics, in business, in economic geography, and then as well as in social anthropology. And I was definitely pulling on all those quantitative modeling skills in this position. But I think there was an element. I feel like I was a social anthropologist sort of pretending to be an analyst in government in some ways, because I was observing just the way that my colleagues around me were working, how the organization worked, the interpersonal relationships, the sort of performances of expertise. Even though I was also performing expertise in that role, it was kind of a funny role to be in, which, again, I'd be happy to expand on this in just a moment. And I think it was really interesting to see an organization from the inside, which is the reason I wanted to take on this secondment. Because often from the government, we see it from, as a researcher or the general public, we only see it from the outside. And what was interesting, I think, one of the things that came out of it from an anthropological point of view was just the sort of circle, for lack of a better phrase, a circle of trust that sort of surrounds people who work in government. In many ways, it's codified by the Civil Service Code, and so to do this, I had to abide by the Civil Service Code, which has many tenets, but basically that you're working in the interest of the government. You won't share information. You're working for the public good, and that you are entrusted with all sorts of information that if it got out into public, it would be either damaging to the government or be commercially compromising or in other ways. And there was this particular, once you're in, I found there was this particular notion of trust that you were dealing with, not just sensitive information, but also like the anxieties of ministers, the personal reflections, the sort of, the strengths and weaknesses of particular ministers and such, and what they were comfortable with and what they weren't comfortable with. And I thought that was a really interesting anthropological perspective, one that I'm not allowed to write on. But it was fascinating, and it really hammered home to me what that sort of circle of trust looks like, to step inside that curtain and then again to step out. I think it was fascinating, and I don't think I would have quite appreciated that without, what Gillian Tech calls that anthrovision of sorts.
And sorry, just to reflect more on that kind of circle of trust. I mean, is this an environment where there's a high staff turnover?
No, no, not really. There's a lot of move. It depends on the particular time period in government. So, for example, when I was there, it was an expansive period because they were creating Great British Energy, and they had a lot of programs that the government needed and still needs to deliver in a relatively short period of time. From the financial people on the call, I think you'll understand that it seems relatively straightforward to spend £8 billion, but it's actually relatively difficult to put £8 billion outside the out to get it out the door in a way that like is, justifiable and responsible and all these things. And so um, there wasn't a lot of turnover. There was a lot of people coming into the organization. And I think at particular times, there's a lot of movement. So people will move between teams or take on different roles, but not necessarily leave the organization. So, and so it's kind of interesting in that that circle of trust continues even if people move around within.
Yeah. Um, can I ask you, what was there anything that kind of struck you as unexpected? Was there anything about working in Desnes that you hadn't expected? Anything surprising?
I thought you might ask me that, Matt, and I didn't know what my answer was going to be. Um, I think there was a I think for me, and maybe it's because I'm coming at it in a slightly with a slightly ethnographic, anthropological perspective. Going into it, I was hoping and wanting to be surprised, and so I didn't really take with me a whole lot of, or at least tried to, if I had any, to try and check them at the door. Any preconceived notions of what this might be, or any sort of, you can think of classical biases of policymakers being, relatively boring or stuffy or all this other things. And so I went into it not really knowing what to expect. And I think one of the things that I think I was really pleasantly surprised by was just at how dedicated the people I worked with are. Like these are people that, a typical person who works in government will work, 9 to 5, 5 days a week. But I don't think that really says just how hard they work or just how, when there's a really tight deadline or policy program, the working the evenings or the weekends in order to get that goal met. And I think it's not just the quantum of work, but the quality. It was really, really impressive, really smart people, very dedicated people. And some of the analysts I had a chance to work with were extremely talented. I don't think they're on this call, but I think of people like Jordana and Adam and other people who were working immediately in my team. Daniel, I'm not going to mention all their last names, but they were, extremely good analysts, very good at what they do, and had like really keen attention to detail. So, and I think that was nice. It made for a really great experience.
It is something that did strike me, in our conversations when you were seconded. I mean, the pace of work just seemed honestly insane. You were under so much time pressure. You had very, very, like upcoming deadlines all the time, and it was a lot of responsibility on you, where you had to provide briefings, right? And your briefings would go to the very top. I mean, I can't help but wonder about then the quality when you're under that much time pressure, and of course with what's going on also in the energy and climate space. It's just, yeah, I mean, is it possible to get it right, have it robust? Is it really anchored in great research, or is this more kind of window dressing?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. Yeah, and I think that this last 18 months was probably, at least most of the colleagues who have been doing this for a lot longer than I have said that, it's been unusually busy because of the amount of like energy and climate change programs the government's been trying to get out the door. But I must say, even though it was relatively fast paced these last 18 months, there's a very intensive internal peer review process for everything. So it really gets checked, double checked, triple checked. Every number, every word gets checked. Everything, all the analysis are quality assured. And that's part of what takes time. So for example, there'd be times when we'd get a question about, and it would be an urgent ministerial question about, could we do X program in this many months, or could we install X number of units of let's say, for example, solar panels, what would that be? What would that cost? How much, and we had relatively short timelines to turn around. It wasn't just me; it was me. I was doing one. I think with an analyst, you're working on one sort of narrow sort of stream, like a couple of work streams, and there's many other analysts that are looking at this. And I think it's some of my other colleagues who were working alongside me. But any answer we gave did have to be thoroughly reviewed, which is part of what takes a bit of time. Um, just gathering the information that we had available at our fingertips, checking that with other colleagues, working on other teams, having that be reviewed, if not twice, then three times to make sure that it was robust enough. And then, before we were to give an answer to a minister, to say that, make sure we had sufficient analytical caveat saying, this is what we think, but, it could change based on these sort of variables within this larger sort of context. So yeah, and I think that was both really exciting to be a part of and really interesting to observe at the same time.
Can I ask you about, and this is maybe a naive question, but like, what is the relationship between the politics of this and then, say, the evidence? I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, are you basically, because you mentioned a part of the code was to serve the interests of the government, not just
Hmm.
of the people. And so when you're serving the interest of the government, I mean, right now we have a Labour government, and so now we then have, GB Energy, for example, that's state-owned. To what extent in your work are you being directed by the political interests, and to what extent are you going more from the evidence, and then the politicians can choose which option aligns best with their political interests?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. People often, wonder like, what is the role of politics in policy making? And I think there's a couple of different aspects of that answer. I think first, you know, I think there's a couple of different things to sort of separate. One, whether it be if you're depending on which team you're working on, whether it be communications, legal, policy, analysis, you're working for the interest of the government and the public good. So that's different than the political party per se. But whoever's in charge of the government, whoever's in power will set the government's agenda. But in whoever the political party is, we're supposed to be working for the greater good. And it's interesting, is you're like, is this just a piece of rhetoric, or do people really believe this? And it was, my observation is that people not just believed it, but really like lived it in their roles in government, the people I worked beside. Um, and for the analysis side, our role was to present the best evidence we could possibly find and the best analysis that we could possibly make in the time limits that we had, regardless of whether the answer was what ministers wanted or not. And we had to give an honest answer as to whether what we thought the outcome of something would be. So, for example, would a particular policy increase bills or decrease bills, and by how much? What was the likelihood? Would a particular program be rolled out at a particular speed? How much money could we spend? How much would units cost? Would something be successful? All of the stuff we had to give honest answers to, within the best of our ability. And I think it was kind of interesting because in some ways, being in this role, it's a back and forth between the people who are doing this work. And so you think of the government as all of these teams working to implement this stuff. But then it's the government who sets the agenda, and the government, of course, are a political party. So often the sort of direction of travel is set by the government. But then we have to give honest answers about whether we think that direction of travel is the right one, or if we should, steer the sort of policy decision in the right way, or sort of tweak it in some way. And so I think, as some of my colleagues would say, if an idea or a question were to come down, we would answer that question, but try and answer it in the most constructive way possible, to say, this is what we think, and this is what we would recommend based on the information we have. And really, it's at the decision of ministers as to whether, they want to take that recommendation or not. Or usually it's not just one, it's usually several. We say, like, here are the several different options. We think this is the best option. These are the other options we think are available to you. And I think from a personal perspective, there's a certain point at which, if all of our analysis and all the recommendations are to suggest that none of these options look very good, for various reasons, it could be analytically, it could be public perception, or whatever. It's really up to ministers and the special advisors who are basically the sort of surround them, because they're the special advisors are political appointees that have to abide by the civil service code, except they don't have to be impartial, so they can be partial. And they really help ministers sort of back and forth between the civil servants and the sort of broader set of stakeholders. And ministers can, have to make a decision about how much political capital do they want to spend on something if all the evidence suggests that it's perhaps not a good idea. Usually, in my observation, that doesn't usually happen. Usually they go with the recommendations that the civil servants put forward. And usually there's a good conversation between ministers and civil servants about, different options, how we came to these options, why we're recommending and such.
Great. I'm going to ask you now a final question, and then I will turn over to everyone else on the call. So for everyone on the call, please think about any questions you might have for Sean, and you can either put it in the chat or you can ask it directly to Sean. So Sean, just my last question for you is going to be about how this experience, how has that maybe shaped the research that you do as an anthropologist?
Yeah, no, thanks, Meta. It shaped it a lot. Like, I think, let me take it in a couple different parts. Coming into this position, I just finished writing the book Carbon Capital, based on research, ethnographic research in Texas with private equity and other financiers of oil and gas in the United States. And part of what that research looked at was the particular set of analytical tools that financiers and other experts, technical experts in the field, use to make decisions about oil and gas extraction. What was really interesting to observe as an anthropologist was that maybe a very similar set of tools are used by analysts within governments to make decisions about energy policy and climate change. How many solar panels we should install, how many wind turbines, whether investing money in particular schemes is a good idea or not. And it's a very similar. It's not maybe not the exact same tools, but it's from the same tool set. In some cases, they are the exact same tools. And so, for me, this is really coming into this position. I started to have an idea of what would I like to do next, and I really was starting to get into, not just get into, but like expand on this idea of this techno-economic toolkit. Again, drawing on some of the expertise of the people on the call, Stefan and Janai and other people who have written in this area. And this experience has really solidified to me that there is a set of analytical tools by which both governments and corporations and other organizations use to shape and inform the decisions they make about energy and climate change. And I could see from the work that I was doing and the other colleagues that I was working alongside with were doing, just how powerful that tool set is in channeling flows of capital or making decisions that like affect all of society, whether it be in terms of energy bills or what our energy mix should be, incentives and such. And so this is really, I think, invigorated me and supercharged me to take this research forward, because I was like, oh my goodness, if this is it's not the only thing, but if this is a common tool set that we use to make decisions, not just in the UK and not in the US, but like globally, then this is really worth digging into some more. Like, what are the ethical underpinnings of discount rates? What is the ethical underpinnings of discounted cash flow? What does it allow us to see? But importantly, what does it not allow us to see? And so that's basically the research I'm taking forward.